I had been in Bali for almost 3 weeks and still hadn't found a reason to leave. I also had no idea the kind of storm that was coming that afternoon. I originally planned to stay only a few days before moving on to another island, but something about the place made time slow down in the best possible way. The morning started early, the water stayed warm, and every day seemed to end with the same quiet promise that tomorrow would be just as good. What I didn't realize yet was how quickly the weather could change there. I had been staying at a small hostel retreat tucked a few streets away from the beach. It was the kind of place backpackers tended to find each other in. Simple rooms, open air common spaces, and surfboards leaning against nearly every wall. People came and went every few days, but the rhythm of the place stayed the same. Wake up early, head toward the water, and spend the afternoon sharing stories about wherever everyone had traveled from. Bali had always been on my list for one simple reason: surfing. Growing up in Australia meant I had spent most of my childhood near the ocean. Weekends were usually spent at the beach, and some of my earliest memories involved learning to balance on a board while my friends shouted advice from the shoreline. Eventually, life shifted in a different direction when my family moved inland to the United States just before I finished high school. The ocean disappeared from my daily life after that. College followed soon after, and before long, the years filled with lectures, exams, and the quiet pressure of figuring out what direction life was supposed to take. Surfing became something I only thought about occasionally, a memory from a different chapter of my life. 2 months ago, that chapter finally closed. I graduated with my degree and realized I didn't actually know where I wanted to go next. Instead of rushing straight into work, I decided to give myself a little time to travel before settling into whatever came after. That decision eventually led me here. Bali had the kind of reputation that made it impossible to ignore if you loved the ocean. Surfers from all over the world seemed to pass through at some point, chasing the long rolling waves that stretched across the coastline. When I arrived, I told myself I would stay just long enough to experience it before moving on. 3 weeks later, I was still there. That morning had started the same way most of my days did. I woke early while the air was still cool and walked down the narrow road toward the beach with my board tucked under my arm. The sky was bright and clear, and the water stretched out calm and inviting as the sun slowly climbed higher above the horizon. The first waves of the morning were perfect. Long, smooth swells rolled in one after another, just big enough to make the ride feel effortless without demanding too much work. A few other surfers were already scattered across the water, but there was plenty of space between us. Everyone drifted quietly with the rhythm of the tide, waiting for the next set to arrive. Hours passed without me noticing. The sun climbed higher and the air grew warmer, while the waves continued arriving in steady intervals. Every time I thought about heading back toward shore, another good set rolled in, convincing me to stay out just a little longer. Eventually, the ocean began to change. At first, it was subtle. The wind shifted direction and the surface of the water grew slightly rougher. The waves started arriving faster and a little stronger than they had earlier that morning. I paddled out to catch one more and noticed the horizon darkening in the distance. Storm clouds. They were moving quickly. Anyone who has spent enough time near the ocean knows how fast weather can turn. But I hadn't experienced anything quite like that afternoon. Within minutes, the bright blue sky began disappearing behind thick grey clouds pushing in from across the water. The wind picked up first. Then the rain arrived. It started as a light mist, the kind that barely feels like rain at all when you're already soaked from the ocean. But within seconds, it turned heavier, falling in wide sheets that blurred the line between the sky and the water. The waves had grown much larger by then. I caught one final ride toward shore, letting the growing swell carry me all the way in before jumping off and pulling my board through the shallow water. By the time my feet hit the sand, the rain was falling hard enough to send everyone else running for cover. The beach emptied quickly. I grabbed my board and jogged up the narrow path that led away from the shoreline. Palm trees bent slightly in the wind, while rain hammered against the road, turning the quiet beachside street into a blur of rushing water and grey sky. Fortunately, there were plenty of small shops along that stretch of road. Most of them catered to surfers and travelers passing through. Little cafes and tea houses where people could sit for a while and watch the ocean. One of them sat just across the street from the beach, its wooden porch offering a dry place to escape the sudden downpour. I hurried inside just as the storm truly arrived. Rain pounded against the roof while the wind pushed curtains of water across the road outside. A few other surfers had already taken shelter there, shaking the rain from their hair and laughing at how quickly the weather had turned. I leaned my board against the wall and stepped further inside, grateful for the simple roof above my head. It looked like I was going to be waiting there for a while. Being at the shop, I decided to take a seat, and fortunately, it wasn't too crowded. There was still a cozy chair open near the window, one of those spots where you could sit quietly and watch the weather pass through without being in anyone's way. Luckily, I had grabbed my bag before leaving the beach, and I pulled a dry shirt from it, changing quickly before settling down. I ordered a cup of tea and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the rain was falling hard now. Water streamed down the window in long, twisting lines, while the wind pushed the palm trees along the street. Every few minutes, a strong gust would send another wave of rain across the road, blurring the view of the beach beyond the shops. I sat there quietly watching it all. My thoughts began to wander. Moving to the United States had been one of the hardest changes of my life. Growing up in Australia meant the ocean had always been close by, and nearly everyone I knew had been part of the same small circle of friends I had grown up with for years. Suddenly, all of that was thousands of miles away, roughly 9,000 miles actually. At the time, it felt even farther. I remember the first week after we arrived. My dad had taken a new job that paid more than he had ever made before, and the move had come quickly once the opportunity appeared. We ended up in a much larger house than the one we had left behind, sitting on a quiet street where everything felt unfamiliar. That first week, I felt down more than I let anyone notice. Everything around me felt different. The streets, the schools, the way people spoke, even the food in the grocery stores. It was one of those strange moments where life improves on paper, but your mind still needs time to catch up with the change. One afternoon, I walked outside and noticed something sitting in the driveway. A truck. It was brand new, still shining in the afternoon sunlight, as if it had just rolled off the lot. My dad stepped outside a moment later with that quiet smile he sometimes had when he knew he'd surprise someone. He said it was a way of apologizing for moving me so far away. At the time, I didn't know what to say, but it helped more than he probably realized. School started soon after that, and to my surprise, the transition was easier than I expected. I had worried for weeks that it would be difficult to fit in somewhere completely new, but people were curious the moment they heard me speak. My accent did most of the work. Everyone wanted to know where I was from, how Australia compared to where we were now, and whether the beaches there were really as good as people said they were. Conversations started easily, and before long, I had a small group of friends who made the days feel normal again. That first Friday after school is still one of the clearest memories from that time. I had been driving home when I noticed a car sitting on the side of the road with its hood open. Back home in Australia, it was normal to stop and check if someone needed help, especially on quieter roads. So without thinking much about it, I pulled over behind the car. A guy about my age was standing there looking at the engine with the kind of expression that suggested he had no idea what he was doing. He introduced himself as Davy. The car, according to him, was a piece of junk he had bought cheap from a neighbor, and it had finally decided to stop running altogether. After a few minutes of trying to figure out the problem, we realized the easiest solution was simply towing it the rest of the way back to his place. So that's exactly what we did. We tied the car to the back of my truck and slowly made our way through the neighborhood until we reached his driveway. By the time we unhooked the rope, the sun had already started dropping toward the horizon. Instead of heading straight home, he suggested we grab pizza. After that, we ended up playing a few rounds of pool at a small place down the street. What started as a quick stop to help someone on the side of the road ended up turning into the beginning of one of my first real friendships there. Looking back now, that day changed the entire direction of how I felt about moving. Outside the tea shop window, the wind picked up again, snapping me back to the present. Rain continued pounding against the glass while the storm pushed across the coastline. Somewhere beyond the row of shops, the ocean was still rolling in heavy waves. For the moment, though, I was perfectly content sitting in that warm chair with a cup of tea, listening to the storm move through Bali. College ended up being a completely different experience from anything I had imagined when we first moved to the United States. By the time I arrived on campus, I had already spent several years adjusting to a new country, making friends, and slowly figuring out how life there worked. What once felt unfamiliar had become normal, and instead of feeling out of place, I found myself curious about what direction everything might take next. I ended up studying business with a focus on marketing. At first, it seemed like a practical choice more than anything else. Business degrees open doors in many different directions, and marketing in particular fascinated me because it was really about understanding people. The best marketers weren't just selling products, they were reading behavior, noticing what people were drawn to, and figuring out how to connect those interests with something meaningful. In a strange way, it reminded me of something I had been doing my whole life. Growing up near the ocean in Australia had taught me how to read waves and weather, while the years after moving to the United States had taught me how people worked. Different groups, different personalities, different motivations. Once you spent enough time paying attention, patterns began to appear. That ability turned out to be surprisingly useful in business classes. While other students focused heavily on numbers and charts, I found myself paying more attention to the psychology behind things. Why someone chose one brand instead of another, what made people loyal to certain ideas, and how a good story could shape the way someone saw a product or experience. I was good at it, not because I had studied it longer than anyone else, but because I had experienced a lot already. Moving across the world at a young age, learning to adapt quickly, meeting people from different backgrounds. All of those experiences quietly sharpened the way I understood how people thought. By my third year, I had a pretty clear picture of what I thought my future might look like. Sports marketing. It seemed like the perfect combination of things I cared about. Sports had always been part of my life, especially anything connected to the ocean. Surfing, travel competitions, outdoor brands, the kind of industries built around movement and adventure. In my mind, it all made sense. I imagined traveling from place to place, helping promote events or working with companies that built gear for athletes and explorers. It sounded like a career that could keep me moving instead of sitting behind the same desk for the next 40 years. When graduation finally arrived 2 months ago, that plan still seemed reasonable. But something interesting happens when you finally reach the point you've been working toward for years. The moment arrives, the degree is in your hand, and suddenly the path that once seemed obvious becomes less certain. I realized I didn't want to rush straight into the next step. For years, my life had followed a very clear structure. School, semesters, exams, internships, always moving toward the next requirement. Now that it was finished, I wanted a little space before committing to another long stretch of routine. That was how the idea for the trip started. Just a few months of traveling before settling into work. See a few places I had always wanted to visit, reconnect with the ocean again, and clear my head before figuring out where to go next. Bali quickly found its way onto that list. It was almost impossible to talk about surfing without hearing someone mention the island. Friends had visited before and described warm water, long rolling waves, and a relaxed rhythm of life that seemed built around the ocean. When I finally arrived, I understood what they meant. The days passed easily there. Mornings began with the sound of waves and the quiet movement of surfers heading toward the water before the crowds appeared. Afternoons were slower, filled with cafes, small markets, and travelers exchanging stories about the places they had come from. The whole place felt like a pause in time, which was exactly what I needed. And now, sitting in that tea shop while the storm rolled through outside, I realized this unexpected moment was part of that pause as well. Life had carried me across continents, through schools and cities and friendships I never would have expected, all the way to a small shop on the coast of Bali while rain poured against the windows. For the moment, there was nowhere else I needed to be. The tea was warm in my hands, the storm was slowly moving past the beach, and somewhere beyond the rain, the ocean was still waiting for tomorrow morning's waves. The storm eventually began to slow. At first, it was almost unnoticeable. The rain that had been pounding against the windows softened slightly, and the strong gusts of wind outside grew less frequent. Water still ran along the street in shallow streams, but the sky no longer looked as heavy as it had an hour earlier. Inside the tea shop, the quiet returned. A few people were still sitting near the windows watching the weather, while others leaned back in their chairs speaking softly with friends. The lantern lights above the counter gave the room a warm glow, and the steady sound of rain against the roof had settled into something calmer now. I took another sip of my tea and watched the clouds slowly move across the sky. Moments like that always had a way of slowing my thoughts down. When everything outside grows quiet again, the mind naturally begins drifting through old memories, moving through different chapters of life without much effort. One of those memories returned to me then, buying my first plane ticket out of the United States. It had been late in the evening when I finally made the decision. Graduation had just passed, and the excitement of finishing school had slowly turned into a strange kind of uncertainty. Everyone around me seemed to know exactly what they were doing next. New jobs, new cities, new plans. I was the only one sitting there wondering if I needed a little time before jumping straight into that next step. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table while I looked at flight websites, casually scrolling through destinations that felt impossibly far away. I wasn't even sure where I wanted to go at first. I simply knew that I wanted to see a little more of the world before settling into a routine again. Bali appeared almost randomly. Someone had mentioned it weeks earlier while talking about surfing, and the name had stayed quietly in the back of my mind ever since. Warm water, endless coastline, and waves that seemed to roll in forever. It sounded like the kind of place where time moved differently. I stared at the screen for a while before finally clicking the purchase button. The confirmation email appeared a few seconds later, and suddenly the trip was real. One simple decision had changed everything that was about to happen next. At the time, it felt like a small leap. Now, sitting on the other side of the world, watching a tropical storm pass over the ocean, it felt like one of the best decisions I had ever made. Outside the tea shop, the rain slowed to a light drizzle. The wind that had been pushing the palm trees earlier had almost disappeared, and a few soft rays of late afternoon light began breaking through the thinning clouds. The street outside slowly came back to life as people stepped out from doorways and cafes, checking the sky as the storm drifted farther down the coast. The ocean beyond the shops had settled as well. The waves were still larger than they had been that morning, but the surface of the water had smoothed again as the last of the rain passed through. In the distance, a few surfers were already beginning to make their way back toward the beach, boards tucked beneath their arms. I finished the last of my tea and stood from the chair near the window. The storm had moved on now, leaving behind that quiet calm that sometimes follows heavy rain. The air outside smelled fresh, and the warm coastal breeze had returned as if the weather had simply needed a moment to reset itself. I stepped out onto the street and looked toward the ocean. The sky above Bali was slowly clearing again, and the long stretch of beach was glowing softly beneath the fading light of the afternoon. The storm that had arrived so quickly was already becoming just another passing moment in the day. Tomorrow morning, the waves would be waiting again. And for now, that peaceful rhythm of ocean, travel, and quiet adventure felt like exactly where I was meant to be.